I'm Dale Sorensen, and I'm here to welcome and introduce Frank Lipo from the Oak Park Historical Society and Museum. He is the face of history in Oak Park, and Frank has been the center of it for over 30 years. And I'll let him tell you how much more of his experience is Oak Park related. Anyway, we're going to be here for an hour, and he's going to be talking about the road to fair housing in Oak Park. And then he will be back next week, and you will have a chance between now and then to feed him your questions, and I'll make that easy for you during the week. You can ask questions today too. Thanks for coming, Frank.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm immediately going to ratchet it down because, you're all the faces of history, right? That's one of the things about this community. We've all experienced so much history. Yes, 30 years working for the Historical Society of Oak Park River Forest, over in Pleasant Home, and now at the corner of Lake and Lombard and Oak Park River Forest Museum. But that's the great thing why I enjoy the job so much. There's obviously so many stories. And there's always, and I think good history sometimes, especially in a polarized time in our country, people want things to be a little bit more black and white than they are. That there's not these nuances. And I think, obviously, Black History Month is on the topic. We're talking about Black Americans and white Americans and how kind of what's some stories that happen. Some real stories that I believe I'm sharing with you, things that have happened in our community. But still, in this, this relatively brief, this morning, I'm just going to touch on some topics that perhaps at the end of my presentation and then next week, as Dale just said. So I'm going to, there's one thing I think I left out, or left on the chair here, and then I'll launch into this. Okay, so you see here, the road to fair housing in Oak Park, right? The road to fair housing, that's 1968. But what about up to our time? What are some things that are the legacy and things that we still need to do? Or people tend to think something's been done, but then it needs to be done over and over again, or maybe there's a new variety of things that need to be done. So that's one of the, just to give you some more attention. And just before we advance, it's like I'm going to talk over time, and again next week. The book the Historical Society published, Suburban Promised Land, talking about some of these stories. A free Black History bike tour where you can just go around town to, I think it's 16 sites, and kind of see some of the stories I'm talking about today. The idea of a real historical moment, like one of the fair housing marches in 1966, summer of 1966. And this was actually recently, just about a year ago, for the 150th anniversary of Oak Park River Forest High School, we have an exhibit about those stories. And we had the principal and the history teacher, a range of folks coming to talk about, sort of Black history at the high school and what the realities of current students and teachers and staff, etc. So I think, for me, one more thing is, talking about the faces of history, you might have lived, certainly in the latter part of this presentation, you've lived some of that history yourself. So I always look forward to hearing other stories, not just an official story that I'm telling, right? Let's start kind of toward the beginning. The reason it says 1900 is this photograph. Some of you know these stories, of course, and I know some of you have been in the community a long time and participated in some of these things, but I think there's sort of a myth on Black history in Oak Park. Some people still are sort of like, oh, when Dr. Julian moved to town in the 1950s, he was the first Black resident. Just last week, I went to a presentation by a consultant talking about the Chicago Avenue corridor, renaming it for Dr. Julian and doing some landscaping and some and the consultant said, Julian, the first black family in Oak Park. So I was sort of afterward, oh, maybe you can tell some other stories. Even though Dr. Julian's story, of course, should be told, there are some broader and different stories. So this is to the left is the Mount Carmel Baptist Church, built in 1905, as early as in the 1880s. There's the first Black resident of Oak Park. Oak Park wasn't its own village then, as part of Cicero Township, shows up in the U.S. Census. And in Henry Austin Gardens fame, the Austin neighborhood, Henry Austin Sr., Jr., Wallace Austin, and the list goes on of family members who are involved in the community. When he died, at his memorial service, there's talk about how generous he was to allow the Negro residents to use Temperance Hall, that little white old schoolhouse building at the corner of Lake and Forest that was on the edge of the Austin property, because the Austin property extended to Lake Street from today's Austin Gardens. It went all the way to Lake Street. And they talked about how he was so generous in spirit that he believed that worship and and religion was part of Oak Park's DNA. And so this black community used that church building, which is sort of the cradle of the churches, including First Congregational Church, what became First Presbyterian Church, etc., all would meet in this small building, and later on the black residents were welcome in to meet there. They also rented a storefront along Lake Street, we have a historic photograph showing where they met. This 1905 building, and there's a number of the church members in front of it, were actually a Philander Barclay photograph, the famous local photographer Philander Barclay, and we have the identifications, the names of the folks there. He knew them as real people, he was there at the dedication of the church, etc. And this church, though, in 1905, this is kind of a theme, I think. I think people want to have, like I said, in a polarized way, Oak Park was racist till it was not, or Oak Park was this until it was that. I think there's always been that mixture. I think one of the things that's true is our predecessors, those of you who are Oak Park residents, our predecessors, there was always a mixture. I think it was much more welcoming than some places. There was somebody in a book at one time called Oak Park one of the sundown towns. And it's 100% wrong. I talked to this author, because a sundown town by its definition means that it was okay for black people to work there, but you can't live here, leave at sundown was sort of the implication. And that was a reality in American life, sometimes sort of written into ordinance and sometimes just, obviously we don't want you people here, right? But in Oak Park's case, from the early, there was a black church. There was, at the high point in the early days until the 1970s, there was about 175 black residents. So again, not just 10 or 5 or a few folks. Yeah.
Where is that?
So this is, that is today's Westgate. So if you go out the backside of Target and you make a left, like right there, kind of a little bit down was where that building is, the village, and working with the Historical Society and a bunch of other folks, put up a monument there. It's kind of in like a planting area, not a literal spot, but kind of a little bit down from that spot. So that's today's, it was called William then. It actually was kind of a dirt alley, had like some early automobile shops, had a couple dairy depots. That was sort of the center of the black community, obviously as a church, black church and churches in general, a meeting place. But I talked about this openness and this sort of two sides of the story. Originally, this congregation bought a lot at Kyler in Chicago, and they wanted to build there. And they first got a permit issued. And then some neighbors said, wait a second, why is a black church coming up here? And they sort of lobbied back to Village Hall, and they kind of worked out. So in the Oakleys, it's like, church at Kyler in Chicago. The Oakleys was printing, like a drawing of what the church was going to look like. And then there's this pushback from some white residents. And instead, they kind of pulled their money, some of those folks up there, and bought them out. And then they bought this lot on William Street. So again, there was racism or discrimination at that time, but it also, some communities would not have sort of allowed a black church to be built, right? Now remember, Oak Park's only incorporated as a village in 1902, so 1905. And I was saying earlier, there's a paper trail of this small black community meeting earlier. The other thing that some people don't realize is west into River Forest, kind of where the commercial strip is, where Weebolts used to be, etc., like along the tracks, that was actually a small black neighborhood. Later kind of an Italian neighborhood, some Italian immigrants. So there's a little area there because along Lake Street was a number of little businesses. There was the, what became Hostess, there's like the big dairy, it's a Bowman Dairy, and right next to it was like a Continental Baking, which made Twinkies later, right? So there's a sort of this commercial strip that there's a black neighborhood in. So a starting point. 1905, opportunity because there was a church and because there were black residents here. Some folks in that photograph owned their own property, had their own businesses. There were a fair number of servants, folks who worked as cooks or works in some of the homes in Oak Park. Now, wow, you say, Frank, this is Oakley's, 1920 on the left. This is like 1914 or 15, something in that range. I don't have a mark there. Churches, in this case, First Presbyterian Church, one of the predecessors, obviously, of First United, they're having minstrel shows, right? For a good cause, benefiting Jefferson Park Church Boys Gymnasium. You know, the sort of stereotypical and sort of, language of sort of dialect language, black dialect there. So, like, in Drexler, the same family for Drexler Funeral Home overlapping it, the building on Lake Street, they have the storage company, today's Drexler building that's still there next to FFC. They're sort of using, if you look closely, it's sort of like, essentially the implication is even these folks are smart enough to use Drexler. It's kind of, so there's a lot of that kind of language. So yes, there's racism in our society, obviously even today, but the idea that a place that's welcoming and yet was not always as welcoming as maybe in today's, what we would like to see today, speaking for us collectively maybe. So in the 1920s then, so that's 1905, in the 1920s, there was a chapter of the KKK in Oak Park. And so some people, now talking about this now again in history, everyone was racist in Oak Park because there's a KKK chapter. This is a very small number of people. Again, very terrible, no matter what the numbers are. They, in the 1920s in the North, there's been a fair amount written about this, it was really as much, of course they were anti-black folks, that was just in the DNA of the KKK, but it was actually, the motivating force was a lot of anti-immigrant, sort of those Catholics, those Jews, those new folks that aren't Americans. And so this is an ad up here in the Oak Leaves, 100% Americans are wanted. Now, part of that would extend back to black people. Yeah, we wanted you over here to be slaves or to do our work, but we don't really want you as citizens. We don't really think you're fully equal to us. So that's the KKK chapter. There's also a women of the KKK chapter in a rare push for women, for women's rights. They weren't just an auxiliary. It was a whole separate group. It was actually set up by some of the women who said, we don't want to just be like an auxiliary of the KKK. It was equally, hateful as an organization. Anonymously, this organizational certificate for the Oak Park chapter and for some of their minutes and records called the Willosis Club. Oh, Willosis Club, that could be anything, right? And we have some of the minute books and things that were anonymously given to the Historical Society years ago. And so this is, right here in our community, we're having this active, imagine a black church and also the KKK in town. For some of there's a lot of recruiting in the sort of mainstream Protestant churches in Oak Park, because there's sort of that anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, so they're trying to, certain more, for lack of a better term, more conservative congregations or congregations that were open to that kind of thing. The minister said, yeah, we don't think those folks are American enough. They're diluting our country by these incomers. So you have this relatively brief movement, and those of you who have paid attention to this in the last year or so, it was the 100th anniversary of the very restrictive immigration law of 1924, that there's a push to try to make it more inclusive, more countries, and they kind of settled on will allow more immigration, but the sort of Northern European, Western European countries that are most represented already. So that restricted a lot of Asian immigration, which had been restricted, and certainly not from Africa and other places. So let's step back from Oak Park just for a second, okay? This is from Gary, Indiana, one of the subdivisions, Gary Heights, highly restricted. So you see highly restricted in this era, in the 20s. This is a 1925 publication. A sales flyer, really. It's actually a four-sided, this is the one side. Only white people can find homes, you can see there in black and white. Yes, highly restricted often meant, and sometimes people conflate it all, zoning's inherently racist because it restricts people. It's overlapping. Zoning has been used in a racist purpose, in some communities in particular, but it was sort of you could talk about being restricted property it has to be brick homes, or it has to have a certain characteristic, or the lot has to be a certain size. Or you can say, wait a minute, maybe those Jewish folks and those black folks aren't allowed to buy this property, right? And here, you say, okay, no, this is exactly what it is. So that's, all this kind of stories, there's what people are doing kind of on the sly or off to the side, what people are telling you they're doing, right off the bat. So back to Oak Park. So this black church, is on the left here, another view of Oak Park's West Gate. That was called William, as I said, more narrow, unpaved early on until probably like the teens. And this is the sort of urban renewal of 1932, where with the growth of all the big department stores in downtown Oak Park, Marshall Field's building, obviously today still, building, and all those other sort of branches, the Fair Store, etc., that came to downtown Oak Park, making downtown Oak Park the west suburban shopping district, right? And also the sort of far west side of the city, people from Austin, Garfield Park would come to Oak Park as, these shopping district instead of going downtown. A guy named Nicholas, Robert Nicholas, who owned some land in downtown Oak Park, he and some other folks started like buying up property and trying to make Oak Park even bigger and better in the downtown core. And so one of the things that was done is they came up with a plan to, what's the new name for William Street and Westgate, the western gate of Oak Park, Westgate, and they kind of came up with an Old English kind of like Tudor revival, theme. That and Deco was kind of becoming popular, so there's some buildings in that area. So that's when you sort of see this side of Lake Street, some redevelopment along there, and some of these old, like you see that sort of like garage building. Some they just put like a Tudor front on them, and sort of tied it all together. So essentially, that black church had already dwindled. So the height of population was 1920 for black folks in the U.S. Census. This is one source. And by the late 20s, with all this downtown Oak Park thing, the sort of growth of downtown Oak Park, this sort of talk, there's some stuff that appears in local papers. There's both internal church dissension and one would say sort of development pressure saying, do we really want this little black church back when we want to have all these big commercial buildings in this area? And so it's not quite clear. There was definitely some like the real estate folks working with the village officials to like bring this plan to fruition. One time in Christmas of like 29 or 30, I think it was, no, it was 29, right before 30, there was a suspicious fire that caused a couple $100 of damage in the back of the black church. So some people have said, well, they were trying to burn them out. It's not quite clear because the church itself, dwindling membership, some of the church members said, let's just sell this and get out and build another church elsewhere. It is getting kind of this big commercial area and we're kind of this little church. Other people are like, no, we want to stay here. So within the church, there's stuff that appears in the oak leaves, like an ad saying, Witherspoon, Jones, and Smith are no longer associated with our church. They have been church elders. So there's some of that going back and forth. So again, it's more complicated than just White Oak Park wanted the black church out, but certainly some in the community and the fact that this is a commercial area that they wanted to expand. So Westgate, that church gets bought out. They buy it out, don't condemn it, don't steal the property. They buy them out, and that basically downtown Oak Park becomes, in terms of construction, right as the Depression is hitting, right? So there's not going to be any new construction for a while in the 30s and 40s anyway with that in World War II. So this decline of the black community, some folks, there's an oral history that Lee Brook did years ago, with somebody said, oh, mom, dad were like, oh, we're just kind of not wanted around here anymore. And this one family stayed in North Oak Park, they owned a house up there, but they were feeling that with the church being pushed out, that was our community center. And Oak Park, then as now, you might call it gentrification too, right? Like property values go up when you build these big downtown, these big 4 or 5 story buildings where there had been the 2-story frame building. So the whole economics of the era was changing. They're still, and they're never stopped being black residents, but at a high from like 175, it went down as low as maybe 40 by like the 1960 census. So there's a decline in black population. This black church is pushed out. People in Oak Park, some of the black folks that remained, before Dr. Julian arrived even, and his wife Anna, and their kids, and this is something hopefully this, and maybe some of you know this, while the number of African Americans in Oak Park workforce declined in the 30s and 40s, some white folks continued to maintain a progressive focus on racial issues. Reverend Albert Buckner Coe, who served as pastor from 1930 to 1949 at First Congregational Church, was the leading example of a prominent white citizen who brought public attention to American race relations. In the 1930s, Reverend Coe initiated the Sunday Evening Forum, which brought nationally known and sometimes controversial speakers to his Oak Park church. Like Reverend William Barton, the earlier minister, and Reverend Joseph Roy, who was an abolitionist minister associated with Congregational Church, he was considered a friend to the black community. And you see here, the thing that is Zora Neale Hurston, formed the First Congregational Church, and it wasn't just the church. There's the 19th Century Club. Langston Hughes is coming to town. And there's also earlier churches, different churches, not just First Congregational or First Presbyterian. There were Ida B. Wells speaking, I think it was at the Baptist Church, talking about her anti-lynching campaign. And that was after the 1905, I think it was around 1910, after the black church was in town. And at first she was going to speak at the black church. And ministers, including at the First Baptist Church, said, no, come over here. We're a bigger congregation. This is something we all should hear about. So there was always that streak, maybe a little bit of a through line back to the abolitionist movement, a little bit like some of the ministers and some of the folks who, from the religious community, from churches, were sort of like, wait a second, we have to know about this. We have to be welcoming. So again, there was the range of support and lack of support for black residents. But this is one thing that really was, really the community started getting known for it. And I just one more quote from, I mentioned Langston Hughes. I know that the infant welfare in around 1940 had Paul Robeson came and spoke at the high school under the auspices of the infant welfare. Different other groups and individuals. The Reverend Albert B. Coe also is a friend of the colored people, wrote Philander Barclay, photographer, historian. He often has colored speakers at his forum. No doubt one of the best friends in the colored race of Dr. Coe is James Weldon Johnson, the poet, who has appeared before his audience many times within the past few years. In addition to his famous poet, you might know him as the lyricist of Lift Every Voice and Sing, sometimes called the Negro National Anthem, which is something that. So these folks that were coming and speaking, and some people from churches and other places, the 19th Century Club, that were aware of and weren't the dyed-in-the-wool racists. We don't want those people coming to town. But again, there's sort of like, how far did that support go? Small number of black folks living in the community. And, so it's sort of like a lot of things in life. What's this sort of triangulation of what is really the sort of the heart and soul of the community? Here's one example of the heart and soul of the community. Black church closed in 1931. Black population had already started dwindling between 20 and 30. How to say this clearly, there were individual black residents who were more or less prominent, had businesses of their own, et cetera. It wasn't like it was being ignored in the paper, like, Joe Jones, who has this business income. So it wasn't like, they were completely isolated in terms of like the black community. There were two graduates that are documented, two black graduates of the high school in 1923, that they're there in the yearbook, and we know some of their family stories, have looked into it. But even for the white students at Oak Park River Forest High School, not as many people graduate. People would drop out to work. Not everyone had the means or the desire to go on to college anyway or whatever. So even though Oak Park was a large, one of the largest big public high-level high school, like really aspired to be a college prep sort of high school. But individual students, and Lewis Pope was one of them, he graduated in 1938. He's in the tradition of excellence. He was inducted luckily before he died, not posthumously, came back to Oak Park and told some of these stories. In the fall of 37, he was, at that point, the one black player on the football team. Again, there had been a few others before and after, but at that time, he was the only black student. They went undefeated. They were like, we're Cook County champions. I think they called it the Suburban League at that point. There's a couple different names to the conferences they were in. And they played Evanston, that had several black players on the team. Evanston always had a black population, as Oak Park did. It was a larger but more segregated population. There was like a black school in town. There was two YMCAs, a black YMCA, a white YMCA. So that part of town there's larger numbers, but like maybe more outright segregation versus, although the black community might have been centered around today's Westgate, there's folks who lived in own properties, et cetera, all over. So Lou Pope, he's like one of the stars of the team. He's one of the backs. They go undefeated, and Super Bowl Sunday. He goes. Somebody from Miami, Florida, at Miami Senior High School, but actually was a booster associated with this brand new stadium that had just opened. that wasn't yet called this, but the next year or two it was renamed the Orange Bowl. They had a big stadium, and they said, oh, we'll invite that Oak Park team. They can get some national headlines as the best team in the North. We think we're the best team in the South. Let's have an exhibition game. And they invite Oak Park to come down to the Orange Bowl, what we now know as the Orange Bowl, and to play on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, I believe. And so, wow, we get to take a train down and go to Florida and play this other team. They accept. And then somebody from one of the boosters down there is like, wait, you have a black player? Like, we didn't think that. Why would you? You know, from their perspective, right? So, and so they said, oh, well, he can't play. Like in, the Jim Crow laws of the South, he just can't play. We don't do that down here. And it led to a long series of letters to the editor, people in the community trying to say, well, what's the right thing to do, some people said. And in the end, he didn't go, and the team went down there and played to a 6-6 tie. The nuances of it are really, again, the nuances is part of my theme here. His mother didn't want him to go because he wouldn't be able to stay with the team, and he probably would have stuff thrown at him, and just who knows what would happen. He had mixed messages from his own teammates and from the administration. They're kind of like, well, what do you think, Lou? Obviously, you're part of the team. If you don't want us to go, we won't go, kind of thing. But for like a high school senior, your buddies, or, so it kind of went back and forth. So in the end, we have actual letters, copies of letters. We've got the Oak Park River Forest High School archives. I'm really proud of to bring that to part of what we do. And there's letters from the NAACP and from the Urban League and stuff saying, what are you guys doing? I thought you were a more progressive community, even at that point of the time. That is what we consider progressivism today, maybe. So basically, it becomes this thing back and forth, and there's some really wonderful letters to the editor. And one of the best that we have on display in this exhibit we have called Open House, we have the whole text of the letter that people would take away. Dr. Percy Julian, who's living in Maywood, moved to Maywood, this is December of 37, he writes the letter. And basically, he had looked in Oak Park for a place to live when he was taking this job with Glidden to head the paint company's sort of research division. Ended up buying a house in Maywood instead. And part of his story is I couldn't even stay at the YMCA myself. And you say he's your teammate, he's a member of your team. So the high school did a whole weird thing where they had him come, and in the old auditorium, they heard the radio, sort of broadcast from Florida of the game, and he was almost doing play-by-play. He came into the auditorium and they gave him a standing ovation. It's Lou, we're not like them, we love you, but you're not allowed to play, so it's a whole, and people wrote sarcastic things. Oh, maybe you should, the Chicago Defender had a thing about, maybe you should dress him up as a clown and you could be a water boy. They were come on, obviously the Defender pushing back, why wouldn't he go in the first place unless you just want him to be that kind of, sort of racial stereotype. So anyway, it goes back and forth, and a guy named Warren Stevens, who was actually one of the founders of the Historical Site back in the late 60s, early 70s. The whole problem of leaving Lou Pope off the team poses a question in ethics. He was a sports editor then, Warren Stevens, December 9th, 1937. Judging from letters to Oakleys and casual conversations about town, many village people think that the local school should have refused the game immediately after any question of racial discrimination was suggested. Such action would in all likelihood have been in keeping with the fear and liberal attitude traditional in the community. So the self-image was already we're not really like those racists in the South. But in the end, he didn't play, and they got their way. Percy Julian, who's in Maywood, writes a letter to the Oakleys. 1938, fall of 37. This is December of 37. So he's not going to move to Oak Park, he and his family, another 13 years. And he says, after the game, and it's a really long letter. It's this part where he's talking about, even as the Nazis were rising to power in Europe, and I traveled in Vienna, and he was saying all these places, I was never refused a hotel. But in Oak Park, the Y wouldn't let me stay. So he's very much like, sort of doing a little bit like what do the kids say today? Kind of a humble brag. He's sort of saying, because he's the PhD scientist who's already, sort of known. After the game and the excitement of your trip are over, some of you, I hope, as a result of this experience, he's addressing to the students, will begin to see the obvious conflict between your elders' social preachments and their social practices. You'll realize that your high school teachers, despite their attempts at rationalization, have officially paid tribute to the teaching of hate in our schools. You will realize the lonely road which Pope has been condemned by this and similar decisions to travel. So here's a moment. He's a graduate of high school in '38. He's a guy that, was one of the stars of the team. And, what's the reality of what the average people are doing or not doing related to this? So, of course, what's the next story? 1938, World War II happens. In World War II, Dr. Percy Julian gets another layer of fame as his so-called pea soup develops from soybeans a firefighting foam that's used on aircraft carriers, because a lot of pilots would crash, and people on the ship and pilots themselves would get burned to death. When you have all that jet fuel and you crash into the surface. And he developed and was said to save lots of lives and people getting maimed and burned and stuff. So Julian in 1950, he actually buys they buy the house in 49, but in 50, Chicago Sun-Times named him the Man of the Year because of that sort of leftover from, he's the only black scientist who has a whole research division. He's got a PhD. He did this stuff during World War II. And so Julian and Anna Julian, a PhD in sociology, they buy this house, and in 1950 and 1951, it gets attacked. One time, someone just throws essentially a Molotov cocktail. Another time, they a half a stick of dynamite in the lawn out front. Nobody's hurt. The first time, I don't think there's ever anyone in the house. They still were renovating it or something. So there it is, racism, people, blocking trying to block the Julians. It becomes more tricky because right away, the police do trace. The second time maybe they found a car that they were able to trace back to the west side somewhere at some sort of flop house apartment hotel, and they never catch somebody. And it's did somebody from Oak Park hire somebody? Is it just somebody who's this guy's moving to town, we're gonna have to keep him out? So we don't have the full story certainly, but when it happens, the next board meeting, dozens of people show up with a petition with hundreds of signatures saying, protect the Julians, this shouldn't happen, this is not what Oak Park's about, etc. So you get sort of this who's really, is it the majority of the people? Is it who's actually behind those particular incidents? And so Dr. Julian and his family stay and say, we don't want to, be driven out. We're here to stay. And obviously, as many of you know, Faith Julian, their daughter, still lives in the house. So all of a sudden, I think it's Time Magazine says, first black family in Oak Park gets attacked. And so there's that whole, and some of the Chicago papers. And so Oak Park, it's like anything else. What's really the right thing to do, and what are people thinking is the right thing to do, and what's sort of a little PR spin or concern, that's not really who we are. And I think enough of the people really felt that, and they had some of this tradition of not being an absolutely closed-minded, racist by design in every level way. So it's sort of well, what do you do with that? Okay, so that's 1950, 51, and there in the 50s, as you well know, by the late 50s certainly, the national civil rights movement's bubbling up. And it's what is going to be the future of race relations in the United States? And what's Oak Park going to play, if at all, in that whole era? So what happens is, and I know some of you last week heard from Ken Trainer about the so-called symphony incident. And when I originally prepared this, I didn't know he was coming last week, but I went to that a lot, so it won't be too repetitive for some of you. So what happens is, essentially, these are a bunch of Chicago headlines. Two things, at least two things, is the bare bones are the director of this, the president of the symphony board, who's one of the players of the Oak Park River Forest Symphony Orchestra, sees this young woman showing up at practice And the conductor, who it was actually Milton Preeves, who's in that image, basically was asked, a friend of a friend, she wants to learn this piece of music you're working on, can she come and practice? Sure, has it practice. But the head of the symphony, she comes up to Preeves afterwards, or the next day, or next time they see each other, and says, what was she doing here? And he's like, just explains what the story is. And she goes, well, Oak Park's not ready to have an integrated symphony. And Milton Preeves kind of goes crazy and is like, I'm going to resign, this is not right. Now she's going to perform, kind of thing. And Milton Preeves actually talks about he have to be Jewish. And he said, I lost relatives in the Holocaust, and remember, this is like 63. This is not, 50 years ago. It's like a lot of I'm not going to be part of something that's going to discriminate. And the story today, again, how things are very clear. The story today is sort of the racist symphony kept out a black, a person. Well, actually, 25 quit orchestra and racial, right away it was very polarizing because a lot of the people in the symphony didn't believe in that. Didn't believe that she should be kept out, or didn't believe that, why wouldn't we be an integrated symphony? So I think you have the president who is, clearly was viewing it from that I don't want this woman here. Not everyone agreed in the symphony, and there's pushback, goes back and forth. So finally, Milton Preeves, I'm still going to resign, but she's going to perform. So she performed. Ken Trainer tracked her down years later, and she, had essentially a professional career for many decades, and was a teacher of music, etc. So this really, right off the bat, it's just a moment in time. It's an embarrassing thing for the village, I think. So much so that the Village of Oak Park board, right in the wake of this, in spring of '63, creates a Human Relations Commission. And now it's the Community Relations Commission, but it kind of creates this idea of there's a mechanism now to start dealing with this. How are we gonna deal with racial change, or what's gonna happen? Austin was not yet, maybe on the cusp of what became white flight. Obviously there was all these national issues, Dr. King's work. So people are what's Oak Park gonna do on some of these issues? So they formed this Community Relations Commission. But I think Oak Park's successes related to some of this stuff from this point on in the 60s and beyond are the fact that you had the Village of Oak Park committed internally not to be, including some of our neighboring communities. I know Cicero and Berwyn were actively saying, stay out, we don't want you people. And then other places were sort of encouraging white flight, run before, the black people come to town, kind of thing. So you had this different ways of dealing with racial change. And a group called, and I bet some of you or people in your family are on this list, the right of all people to live where they choose. In 1964, what became the Citizens Committee for Human Rights formed. So you have a private, not-for-profit lobbying group and a group of citizens that are dedicated. They start within a short order, racial testing of going to an open house with a young black couple and a young white couple. And it's funny how often the young black couple found out the house had already sold. That kind of thing were happening. And then the board of realtors gets involved. Again, a lot of individual good people and realtors, but the board as a whole dug in really quickly against any kind of fair housing stuff. Our clients are free Americans and it's property rights, and they should be able to sell whoever they want to sell to. So it becomes a very, quickly, this is 64, so 63, 64, the symphony incident, this, and it's what's the future of Oak Park? And I love all these. I found out years later, actually, a bunch of you must know, Lee Anderson. He's my next door neighbor until recently for 30 years, more than 30 years, and he grew up in the house next door on Ridgeland where I live. And I only saw about a year ago, I realized he and his parents are, it's alphabetical on this list, signed this. He was a college student age kid. So it's people who were stood up and said, no, the right of all people to live where they choose. What a radical idea. It says, as some of you might be able to read this, we, the undersigned residents of Oak Park and River Forest, believe in the essential oneness of humankind, seeking to foster such unity in our communities, do hereby declare the residents and villages to be open to anyone interested in sharing our benefits and responsibilities, regardless of race, color, creed, or national origin, believe in equal opportunity for all in the fields of education, business, professions, in harmony with the constitutional guarantees of equal rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, The mutual understanding between people of diverse ethnic, racial, and religious backgrounds can be best attained by an attitude of reciprocal goodwill and increased association, that all citizens, in a spirit of justice, dignity, and kindness, should give serious consideration to the challenge that now faces all Americans in the achievement of brotherhood under God. So there's hundreds of people who say, oh, like this is kind of like, we're going to believe in this stuff, we're going to fight for it. So it leads to really more of a movement, which here's an example of overlapping with this. So that's 64, 65. There's the Robinets, Harriet and Mac Robinet. We just recently lost Harriet. Mac still, until her death, Harriet lived in a house they bought in 1965 on 200 block of South Elmwood. But when they were looking for a house in Oak Park, they went to numerous open houses and they couldn't find a home. So people associated with that Citizen Committee for Human Rights would start to go to like open houses on their behalf, and like took some notes. And one, and I wanted to say, Leonard Beiswinger bought their house for them, and then resold it, a so-called straw buyer. So in 1965, these now pillars of the community for 50 plus years, they couldn't buy a house straight out, and I know there's so there's definitely this idea, and when she became a writer, this is from like 68. She looked back, wrote an article about what it was like to be the sort of first black family in a block in suburbia, sort of the story. And one of the things that, right away, some neighbors were very welcoming and some were less so. And one of the things she said years later, so that was 65, in 68, when Dr. King was assassinated, Harriet told me at one point, and she's told some others, it's been written up in the local newspapers, is when he died, she didn't, so taken back, she just put out an American flag that morning, and then later on she looked outside, she saw flags up and down the block. So this idea some people get it, right? So I think this whole idea of knowing people, having them be part of the community and neighbors, not perfect, there's still racism and people aren't always doing the right thing. So all this is overlapping with national news and national civil rights movement. So this I put this in here. There's Concordia and Rosary now, Dominican students, some religious folks, I see a couple nuns there, etc. They march literally at the same time the Selma marches. That's why they march. And they march to the Federal Building in Oak Park from River Forest. The post office was then sometimes called the Federal Building more commonly. They had some federal offices, upstairs or whatever. And so they're basically, the Selma marches and then in Oak Park. And that's 65. 66 starts the summer of the fair housing marches in Oak Park. And one of the flyers we have for that says Selma Oak Park, Selma Oak Park, Selma Oak Park. So there is this very conscious tying into the national civil rights movement broadly. As you're seeing these examples go through, right? And one of the banners that we have on display in our exhibit, Fair Housing, if you haven't seen it, that is from the Robinet family. Basically we seek equal service of realtors. Some of the photographs show of people holding signs, Oak Park resident, because after doing a couple of these, naysayers or maybe letters to the editor all of these outsiders coming in to agitate against it, and they're like, no, we're Oak Park residents. So again, it's a whole concerted effort in trying to think through what this will. They left from Stevenson Park, right next to where the museum is now, Lake and Lombard, and because the Community Relations Commission, I think it was already called, not that it was Human Relations still, met in our building, because it was the Village of Oak Park, sort of used for health department and some other uses. So this is and that's the Oak Park resident signs, and there's clergy and equal. This is the old Kyler Avenue Methodist Church, which I'm trying to think of the exact name now, but I think it's a Episcopal church. Anyway, they're at Kyler, kind of near the high school. So this is really important to understand this, because this is 1967, a year before the Fair Housing Ordinance passed. This is a new form the Board of Realtors did during this era, because we have an earlier one from 63 or something, and it doesn't have this in there. but they added in a section, you shall or shall not offer and show this property to persons of all races. So the Board of Realtors official position and the Illinois State Board, et cetera, started to be like, we're in a mess here. Like, we kind of get why some people don't think it's like we're part of the racism, but it's up to the owners to decide. So we'll just have them fill out the form, and if they say we don't show it to persons of all races, we won't. It'll be up to them. So it's, you know, what you today we might consider like institutional racism. If the forms allow you to do it so easily, you're kind of encouraging something, right? Like it's check, okay, and all you have to do is initial it and say, this one, you shall not offer and show this property to persons of all races. And then it's a regular, this is actually the Board of Realtors at the top. This is through W.R. James. Bob James became a real supporter of fair housing, but he was part of the Board of Realtors, and this is the form. They said, you have to use this form. So that's kind of what, when they're marching closed to Negroes since 1917 is one of the banners, because in 1917 is when the Board of Realtors was organized. So it's a whole thing about like, you know, the industry. Now, sometimes funded by realtors, sometimes funded by people who just didn't want it. What do you do when somebody has a catchy slogan like fair housing? We're all for fairness, right? We love being fair, unless you get forced. So it was like, oh, they're forcing us to like sell our property to people we don't want, you know, to buy it or something like that. So it becomes a whole campaign back and forth. And in 1968, in April, I'm sorry, the first week of May, the Fair Housing Ordinance passed from 5 to 2, and the new high school auditorium is like packed, and there's police there, and people are being, you know, people are threatening people, and 5 to 2. The week after, the village manager, it's pretty amazing, I should have brought that, it's like a whole column, the week after the Fair Housing Park, it's by the village manager saying, what's gonna happen now that Oak Park has passed fair housing? And he goes, nothing that we don't want to. We have a great community. Let's black and white together. Let's do this. And it's funny because it's like, you know, like the kids say, tell it like it is. Or something. Like it's a whole like kind of like late 60s kind of thing. But it's kind of saying like, hey, we're investing in the community. We care about this. So officially the gauntlet's like official Oak Park, the village board at the time, and the next election when some people are opposing what you just did for the Fair Housing Ordinance, it becomes sort of Oak Park's mantra. This is 1968, June, so 3 months after that, only a month after that, a month and a half. Community Relations Commission, to give you a name, is a good family. This family is moving to town. Here's who they are. And we would appreciate you welcoming to them. Virginia Casson, the later clerk, but at that point she was the secretary of the Community Relations Commission. And the whole idea of these move-in memos, there's always like slogans, you know, I talk about straw buyer. In that case, a white family buying a house for a black family and then selling it to them. The thing I just showed you with the Board of Realtors, it was called the M listing. The minority listing. Like, oh, it's an M, is it M listing or not? Is it, can we show it to minorities? This became called move-in memos. You can see the really good intentions of the Community Relations Commission and like the village, you know, sort of manager and stuff. One of the things that's happening other places is a black family would be rumored to move in, and the most racist person on the block would start to be like talking to neighbors like, this is gonna go to hell. What are you like? You know, almost. You know, like it's not that I'm against those people, but like property values will suffer, whatever. So they kind of confronted it by literally going and like saying, "Hey, a great family's moving in. We'll be watching the block and trying to help out if you need help." Like so, they're like, you know, we don't do anything bad, you know, and you know, support these people. And I know Harriet Robey. They did a version as early as '65 because one of the neighbors said to Harriet, like, I know it's kind of like, she knew about this and she's like, now that everyone on the block like knows our story, like, you know, our education and stuff, but we don't know them, it's kind of like, I feel like they kind of single us out. Well, you know, obviously they did it for a reason, but so one of the neighbors like wrote a memo like about like all the neighbors, like, you know, like this person, their kids are really obnoxious, but like, don't worry about that, you know. So like, you know, they had like a whole like, you know, okay, I'll tell you the story, you know. So anyway, so this is that, you know, after like, these are people, they have degrees, they have kids who are going to be at the high school, and, you know, so essentially that was Oak Park's strategy, such as it was over time, because Rupert Wenzel, then a trustee who voted for the 5-2 on the positive side, who is a bug scientist, an entomologist, world-class entomologist at Field Museum, he said, like, somebody said, oh, how do you know all that stuff was going to work? And he said, we didn't. we knew that we didn't want to like not do anything and let the fair market, the free market take over, or to do like something that was like keep those people out. So we were trying an experiment. So that becomes the theme. And it really comes up to today. And here I'm running out of time today, right? Like, okay, the housing center gets formed, based here at First Congregational originally and First United. And like they're doing like hip set, like an interracial group sitting around a fire playing instruments. It's like, okay, but they're saying like we're together and find schools. Remember, this is like 73, 4, 5, right in there. They were using versions of this. Other places are saying like, we're against busing and don't have integrated schools and all this. And they're like showing in the promotional material black and white students in the same classroom, right? So it was kind of something that was a little bit countercultural, at least to some people. So how do you learn about these things? I've already referenced this book that we published. We have this exhibit, Open House Legacy of Fair Housing, and there's just a quick look at it. But this is the thing that strikes me. We opened this up right before COVID, the year before. Unfortunately, except for Mac and Robinet, all these other folks have since passed. But there's left to right, Mac and Harriet Robinet, Ginny Casson, Bobby Raymond, John Dwyer, first chair of the Human Relations Commission, and Sherlyn Reed. So you talk about, like, that's how do we know these stories? Like, thanks again for the nice introduction, but like, the face of history are these people who lived that. So I'm telling stories that I heard from them, that I've done other research, documentation, other people have done that. But it's like, we got to keep on learning and remembering some of these things that were done. And how do you do that also? Here's some Brooks 8th graders coming in, doing some research project related to Black history and some of these stories. Younger kids too, by 3rd graders, coming through the exhibit, etc. And also, the places, I talked about this, like, this free bike tour we have, like on our website, it's a PDF you can just like download, there's the Jefferson family. Their house was attacked actually in 1914, across from Longfellow Park. That house is still there. But the daughter on the left here in a later photograph was one of those first 2 black graduates of high school in 1923. And Fred Jefferson owned like an automobile repair shop on Roosevelt Road later in his life. And his wife had a catering business. So people who lived in the community and their stories are part of this. So yeah, there's all kinds of resources, to learn more about this. But so the point, according to Dale, who reached out to me, it's now to end at 10:45. It's 10:39 now, and then I'm going to come back next week. But the thought was, any quick questions, especially if you know you're not going to be here next week. But if you think in the meantime, or you come ready with some questions, or if you, through Dale, if he fires off an email on Friday and says, hey, a couple people want to know more about this, maybe I can bring some more resources back this time next Sunday and have more of a conversation. But the grounding, did I tell you I think everything I said was true. Did I tell you all the stories? I could keep on down the rabbit hole at any one of these stories and read you other passages, etc. But how do we learn about this stuff? It's step by step, and it's also keep on sharing the stories, and then hopefully me listening, and maybe I'll hear something I didn't know before, or something that could be documented. So that's that for now. So 10:40, tell me if there's any quick questions, etc. Yeah.
Who got the welcome memos? Who are those?
So, the people on the block would actually, timed to be arriving before the people arrived. This week, tomorrow, soon, kind of thing. I didn't tell this other rabbit hole story, but it's great, is a guy named Fremont Nestor was the police chief. He had been a young officer when Julian's house was attacked. He had participated in the investigation. And he told people, I always felt bad we didn't catch anybody. And now is my chance, like, sort of like he was chief by that time. And he was known, if you knew there's a real racial troublemaker on a block, and they did sort of just like, people, like they do today, people call Village Hall and say, Old Man Jones is like saying, he doesn't want those blacks here in town, whatever. And so he would like go and ring the doorbells when he'd hear that and say, oh, yeah, I'm the chief. I'm in the neighborhood. I started to say hi, see how you doing. Are you Joe Jones? Can I have a cup of coffee? Like it was sort of like, it was almost like eyes in the street, like, don't do something stupid. You might be racist, but don't like attack anybody. So it was kind of like, what do? You seed good information, like these people are not, those those poor minorities who are going to ruin the neighborhood. You know, these are people who have some accomplishments, they have good family, but, you know, trying to get people to like look beyond that. Of course, in a more, are today's progressives, oh, how insulting they would do a memo. But part of the idea at the time was the racism was there and obvious, and people were getting, you know, were vandalizing and stuff. So they said, oh, we'll like call them out and show them that these are good people. Anyway, that was sort of the idea. Anyway, but yeah.
That's almost the version that Sherilyn Reed would share with us. She said that the police visited some neighbors and said, if there's any problems, we know where you live.
Yeah.
That was kind of the version she
Yeah,
shared.
it probably depends on how bad they were because the way, maybe she was softening it to me one time and a couple other people were sort of like, you know, when you show up and you're just sort of like, hey, we're just going to keep a tight watch in this neighborhood because we want them to be really welcomed, you know, kind of thing. It's like, oh, okay, they'll know one of the people to go to right away if something gets vandalized or something. So yeah.
I look forward to next week. I have all of the files of the Oak Park River Forest Citizens Committee, of which I was chairman, and I spoke at those hearings, the 5 hearings, the ugliest thing you could ever see. It was us and the realtors were the only people who could talk coherently. So I'm going to give you all the files. I spent the week going through like 10,000 files from my law practice. And I put together a banker's box. I can't make sense of it very much, but by gosh, you're going to get something from it, I think. So.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and one of the things, as some of you know, Lee Brook did sort of a timeline history of that. So that's great because he talks about like his own records sort of set. So that'd be great to use as like a finding aid to like, oh, what was happening at this time, like behind the scenes at the board meeting or whatever. So that's really useful.
And I want to say your presentation couldn't have been more accurate.
Oh, thank you. And any alternative views? Did somebody say no? You gotta know. But yeah, scratching the surface, like all history, and you know, keep on trying to find out what's the stories that we keep on having to tell and to collect and so, and having the documentation. Because somebody said to me, shouldn't the Historical Society like burn that like KKK like document? Somebody said that, and I'm like, no, that's anti-history. And then someone said, we never had chapter there. Oak Park's always been wonderful and not racist. I mean, not that I want to try to make Oak Park look bad or something, but again, it wasn't all Oak Park. It was that group of people that did that. So let's make sure we know those stories. Yeah.
Thanks, Frank. I told him to come with enthusiasm. What do you think?
No.
Thank you very much. This is beautiful. So I'll try to make it easy if you want to send questions during the week. You may get an email from me.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
And I know you're going to the service, et cetera. If there's any questions, let me know. Right now, that would be great. Thank you.